A boy once thrown away like an unwanted burden would rise years later to face the very people who abandoned him. And what he revealed left an entire audience stunned into silence. It was not wealth that built him, not privilege, not the parents who claimed to shape his future. It was something no one in that room expected. For 12 years, the truth waited in the shadows, and when it finally came to light, it shattered every illusion and exposed what real family means. Watch closely, because the twist hidden in this story is the kind that changes how you see loyalty forever. If this pulls you in, hit like, subscribe for more powerful stories, and tell me in the comments how the plot strikes you and where you're watching from. Ethan was only 8, but he already carried the weight of disappointment heavier than most adults could bear. For weeks his parents had watched him stumble through tutoring sessions, his father's jaw tightening whenever Ethan mispronounced a word, his mother's eyes flashing with irritation as he fumbled over numbers that refused to line up in neat rows. Their home smelled of polish, lemon cleaner, and money, but for Ethan, it smelled of pressure, silence, and unmet expectations. Tutors came and went, hired to fix him like he was a broken appliance. They left behind charts, reports, and whispered conclusions that the Collins boy was not meeting his potential. Charles, a man of rigid logic and corporate efficiency, had no patience for imperfection. Vivian, with her polished smile for every social gathering, could not abide embarrassment. To them, Ethan's struggles were a blemish on their reputation, an inconvenience that tarnished their carefully crafted image of success. So on a Tuesday evening, polite as a meeting scheduled in a calendar, they decided. A bag was packed with socks, a sweater still holding the warmth of the dryer, and a toy airplane with a cracked wing. The door opened, the night air cool and indifferent, and Ethan's small shoes paused at the threshold. Behind him, silence more brutal than shouting filled the marble-floored hall. His parents did not scream, did not curse. They simply turned and closed the door, the iron gate swinging shut with a finality that echoed inside him like a verdict. The boy knelt on the pavement, his knees pressing against the rough concrete. His fingers curled around the bag as though clutching it could keep his world from unraveling. The cracked wing toy pressed against his chest, a symbol of everything broken yet still clung to. He stared at the street, at the shadows cast by amber lamps, as if waiting for someone to rush out and call him back inside. No one came. A car rolled past, bass rattling its doors, the driver glancing but not stopping. 2 women lingered at a mailbox, whispering behind cupped hands, their voices drifting. Isn't that the Collins boy? Did they really throw him out? A jogger slowed, tossed a quick, "What's up?" and then sped away, eyes sliding to the side. To them, it was gossip, a scandal for the neighborhood, but to Ethan it was exile. He touched the broken wing of his toy, tracing its jagged edge carefully, as though if he was gentle enough it might heal. The world felt too large, too cold, and he was just a child left outside in it. Inside the house, someone else watched the scene unfold. Mrs. Grace Turner, the family's longtime caretaker, had seen Ethan's struggles day after day. She had stirred pots of soup while tutors barked orders, had guided his trembling hand over flashcards, had told him stories to turn frustration into shapes and rhythms he could understand. She saw the way he held his breath whenever someone demanded focus, the way his shoulders tightened like a soldier bracing for battle. She knew he tried. She also knew effort never mattered to Charles and Vivian. Tonight, as she folded her apron, her hands shook. She had asked them for patience, pleaded softly, reminding them that growth was not a race and storms did not bend to image. But the answer came cold and sharp. Not today, not here. Maybe another strategy, another school. But not here. Grace knew then that if she stayed, she would be complicit. With steady breath, she untied her apron and laid it down like a discarded bandage. She placed her keys in the dish, slid on her shoes, and lifted her head high. She would not abandon the boy who had been abandoned. Stepping into the night air, she saw Ethan sitting on the curb, his small frame hunched in defeat. She knelt beside him, wrapped her wool scarf around his neck, the fabric carrying the faint scent of pepper and onions from her kitchen. She did not offer false promises. She did not tell him his parents would change their minds. She only squeezed his fingers gently and lifted the bag from his lap. "Come on, child," she whispered, her voice rough but steady. "We're leaving." They walked past the manicured lawns and hedges that looked like green sculptures in the moonlight. Neighbors peered through curtains, whispers rustled like leaves in the breeze, but no one opened their door to offer shelter. For them, Ethan's exile was entertainment, a story to sip wine over. For Ethan, it was the moment he learned that wealth could build houses, not homes, and family could share blood but not loyalty. His bag pressed against his ribs with every step, the cracked wing airplane poking him like a reminder that he was broken too. Grace led him to her modest car parked down the street, a vehicle so ordinary it looked invisible among luxury sedans. She opened the passenger door, helped him climb in, and for the first time that night, she spoke more than a whisper. "You're not alone," she said. Her voice was gravelly, like it had carried too many truths over too many years, but in that moment it sounded like the strongest promise Ethan had ever heard. They drove away from wealth and into a part of the city where the shine dulled, where lights flickered instead of glowed, where sidewalks cracked and walls were tagged with graffiti. Ethan pressed his forehead against the cool window, watching mansions dissolve into apartment blocks, each mile taking him further from the world of privilege into one of survival. Grace parked outside a narrow building that smelled faintly of dampness even before they stepped inside. The hallway buzzed with a light that hummed more than it shone. Doors were thin, paint peeling, and laughter from a television spilled from somewhere nearby, colliding with muffled arguments about unpaid rent. For Ethan, it was a world foreign and raw. But Grace unlocked a small apartment at the end of the hall, flicked on the lamp, and set his bag on the floor. The space was cramped, the carpet worn, the air filled with the faint smell of fried onions from a neighbor's kitchen. A couch sat pushed against one wall, its springs squeaking under Grace as she sat for a moment, breathing out her exhaustion. She gestured to the small bed tucked into the corner, neatly made with a thin blanket. "That's yours now," she said. Ethan hesitated, glancing at her, guilt tightening his chest. "Where will you sleep?" he asked softly. Grace smiled, though the weariness in her eyes betrayed her fatigue. "Don't worry about me. I've had couches worse than this." She stood, untied her scarf from around his neck, and smoothed his hair with the same gentleness she had used when he was a toddler afraid of the dark. Ethan climbed onto the bed, the springs creaking but not unkindly. For the first time in months, he fell asleep without the heavy pressure of judgment hanging over him. Days began to stretch into something new. Grace woke before dawn, her shoes scuffing the floor as she prepared for long hours of cleaning offices. She left Ethan with instructions written on scraps of paper, little notes that guided him through the alphabet or simple math problems. He taped them on the wall beside his drawings, the letters backward sometimes, the numbers crooked. But Grace always praised the effort rather than the outcome. "It isn't supposed to be perfect," she told him. "It's supposed to be yours." Her words sank deeper than she realized. Ethan started to see mistakes not as proof of failure, but as part of a rhythm of learning. He waited for her every evening, chin resting on the windowsill as headlights flickered by, counting cars until the sound of her key rattled in the lock. She came home with dust on her shoes, lines deepened on her face, but still she sat beside him at the small table to go over his work. Her eyes sagged with exhaustion, but her voice carried patience, not scorn. The building's residents began to notice the boy. Teenagers loitering on the stairwell whispered about him. "That's the Collins kid, right? The one they kicked out." One of them smirked, shaking his head. Guess his parents had enough. But another voice, quieter, almost ashamed, replied, "That lady still sticks with him though. That's love." Ethan overheard fragments of these conversations, the words clinging to him like dust he couldn't shake off. Sometimes he wanted to disappear, to become invisible so no one could point or whisper. Other times, a fire smoldered inside him, the desperate urge to prove them wrong. Grace noticed these shifts in his eyes, the way his small shoulders carried too much weight, and she countered them with stories from her own childhood. She told him of walking barefoot on dirt roads, of teachers who dismissed her as destined to be nothing more than a maid. She would pause, rub the crease between her brows, then look at Ethan squarely. "They don't get to decide. Neither do your parents. You hear me? You decide." Ethan nodded each time, gripping his pencil as though it were a sword, determined to carve out a future they couldn't predict. To Ethan, who had grown up in sterile silence punctuated only by the ticking of clocks and the measured footsteps of house staff, the noise was strangely comforting. It meant people were close, it meant life was happening all around him, and most importantly, it meant he was not alone. Grace gave him the small bedroom with its single bed and thin blanket, while she took the squeaky couch in the living room without a second thought. He protested once, asking why she could not share the bed, but she only shook her head and said, "This is your place to rest. You need it more than I do." That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, and for the first time in months, he felt a safety that no expensive mattress had ever provided. Grace began to transform the small apartment into something warmer. She taped Ethan's drawings on the walls, the ones with backwards letters and uneven lines, declaring them works of art worthy of display. "It's not supposed to be perfect," she told him when he frowned at his mistakes. "It's supposed to be yours." Those words became a kind of anthem for him. Every time he picked up a pencil or struggled through a word, he heard her voice reminding him that effort was more important than flawlessness. When he left his papers scattered on the table, she gathered them carefully, as though they were precious documents. Slowly, the little bedroom filled with his creations, scribbles, sketches, clumsy letters, until the walls themselves seemed to whisper back encouragement. Life was not easy. Grace woke before dawn every day, lacing up shoes that grew thinner with each step, and headed to her cleaning jobs. She worked double shifts, scrubbing office buildings and vacuuming hallways, her body aching from endless labor. Ethan often sat by the window in the evenings, chin resting on the sill, counting the headlights until finally he saw her silhouette returning, shoulders sagging but steps still firm. She always entered with a smile for him, no matter how tired she was. After dropping her heavy bag and peeling off her gloves, she would sit beside him at the table and go through his schoolwork. Her eyelids drooped, but she never let him face his challenges alone. Instead of scolding when he stumbled, she nudged gently, encouraging him to slow down, to find the rhythm. Letters became like drums, each with a beat of its own, and numbers became patterns he could almost dance with. Ethan began to understand in ways no tutor had ever managed to teach him. The neighbors noticed too. Teenagers lounging on the stairwell whispered whenever Ethan passed by. "That's the Collins kid," one said. "The one they tossed out." Another snickered. Parents probably had enough. But sometimes a softer voice followed, one tinged with shame. "That lady's still with him though. That's love." Ethan overheard pieces of these conversations floating up the stairwell, words that stuck to him like lint. They hurt, but they also fueled something inside him. Some days he wanted to disappear, to become invisible, so no one could point or whisper. Other days, he wanted nothing more than to prove them wrong. Grace saw these shifts in him, and when his shoulders slumped too heavily, she answered with stories from her own childhood. She spoke of walking barefoot on dirt roads, of teachers who told her she would never be more than a maid. She would pause, her fingers pressing against the crease between her brows, then look straight at Ethan with fierce honesty. "They don't get to decide. Neither do your parents. You hear me? You decide." Those words pierced deeper than gossip ever could. Ethan gripped his pencil tighter each time, seeing it not just as a tool, but as a sword to carve out the future they said he could never have. Sacrifice became the invisible fabric of their home. Grace skipped meals so Ethan would never go hungry, sliding plates toward him with a shrug and insisting she wasn't hungry. Her clothes grew older and thinner, but she saved whatever little she could to make sure Ethan had supplies, shoes that fit, and the dignity of not feeling left behind at school. When the old wedding ring on her finger became her only resource, she pawned it without hesitation to buy him a second-hand laptop. It was battered, one key missing, and the screen flickered if the plug slipped, but to Ethan it looked like a doorway to another world. When she placed it on the table, her eyes shone despite her attempt to act casual. "It's not new," she said, "but it still works." Ethan touched it carefully, realizing it represented more than a machine. It was proof of how much she believed in him. At night, he sat cross-legged on the floor, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating his face as he tapped clumsy code and traced patterns he barely understood. The fan wheezed like an old man's breath, but Ethan's eyes glowed with determination. Grace hummed gospel tunes in the kitchen, her voice blending with the hiss of boiling rice, and the sound became his soundtrack of perseverance. The first programs he tried to write crashed, froze, or simply refused to run. He slammed the lid shut more than once, muttering curses under his breath. But every time, Grace appeared silently with a plate of food, sliding it beside him. "Eat, then try again," she said, her tone calm and certain. Slowly, failure began to feel less like an ending and more like a stepping stone. Grace carried the burden of 2 lives on her back, choosing hunger for herself so that Ethan could eat, choosing exhaustion for herself so that Ethan could rest, and choosing obscurity for herself so that Ethan might one day step into light. The neighbors did not see the whole truth, only fragments. They saw the boy with a broken toy now glued to a broken laptop, and they saw the gray-haired woman with lines etched deep into her skin. They whispered that it was hopeless, that no child tossed out by his own parents could ever rise beyond the stain of rejection. Yet in the kitchen where steam from cheap rice rose and mingled with Grace's humming, Ethan felt something those neighbors never understood. He felt chosen. The sacrifices were small in appearance, but immense in meaning. Grace never bought herself new shoes, even when her soles wore thin. Instead, she patched them with tape and scraps. When Ethan's sneakers began to tear, she quietly slipped into a thrift store, finding a pair slightly too big but good enough to last, pressing them into his hands with a smile that disguised her empty wallet. Ethan noticed anyway, noticing how her fingers trembled when she set aside her own needs. He wanted to protest, to tell her he could manage, but the look in her eyes told him it was not up for debate. She believed in his potential more than she believed in her own comfort. He remembered how she once said, "It isn't supposed to be perfect, it's supposed to be yours." Now she lived that truth for him, imperfect but steadfast. Each evening after long shifts, she sat at the small table across from him, her back aching, but her presence unwavering. She never scolded when he stumbled over a math problem or froze at a passage he could not read. Instead, she guided him gently, nudging him toward patience. When his frustration boiled over and he slammed the laptop lid shut, muttering that he was stupid, Grace simply placed a plate of food beside him and said calmly, "Eat, then try again." That simple refrain became their rhythm, teaching him that failure was not fatal, but a step forward. Slowly, Ethan learned that mistakes could be foundations if he chose to stand on them rather than collapse beneath them. Stories from Grace's childhood became his compass. On nights when his determination faltered, she sat with him and told of barefoot walks down dirt roads in a world that never believed in her. She described teachers who told her she would never amount to anything more than a maid, and she admitted how those words had haunted her, cutting deeper than any whip. But then she would lean forward, eyes steady, and declare, "They don't get to decide. Neither do your parents. You decide." Those words landed inside Ethan like seeds planted in fertile soil. He began to grip his pencil differently, not as a fragile tool, but as a weapon against doubt. He began to see coding not as a hobby, but as a battlefield where each keystroke was a strike against the voices that called him worthless. The sacrifices were not just financial, but emotional. Grace bore the stares of neighbors who whispered about how foolish she was to waste her life on someone else's child. She endured the remarks that she was too old to be chasing hope, that she should have let Ethan go and focused on herself. But Grace knew better. She had seen the spark in Ethan's eyes when he looked at the glowing laptop screen, the way he refused to quit even when frustration threatened to consume him. She had lived too long under the weight of other people's judgments to let them decide for him. So she stood in the grocery line with her modest purchases, ignoring the snickers. She walked to work with her patched shoes, ignoring the pitying glances. And she came home every night with her head high, knowing she was raising a boy who would not just survive, but rise. Ethan watched all of it with growing awareness. He began to understand that the meals on his plate were bought with her hunger, that the roof over his head was secured by the hours she spent scrubbing offices, that the chance to type late into the night was purchased with her wedding ring. That knowledge did not crush him, it fueled him. He swore silently to himself that her sacrifices would not be wasted, that every drop of sweat she shed for him would one day be repaid. He learned discipline not from punishments, but from watching her live each day with grit. He learned perseverance not from lectures, but from her weary hands still reaching to steady his. And so the cramped apartment became a sanctuary built on sacrifice. The thin walls carried laughter and arguments from strangers. But within those walls, Ethan and Grace forged a bond stronger than blood. She became his constant, his quiet warrior, the one who stood beside him when the world turned its back. Ethan began to feel a strength inside him, not loud or boastful, but steady, like the hum of a laptop fan that wheezed through the night. He knew that the world still doubted him, that whisper still painted him as the boy who had been discarded. But Grace's belief gave him the power to keep moving forward. Ethan watched with wide eyes as she pulled out a battered old laptop, the kind most people would have thrown away. The screen had scratches across the surface, one key was missing, and the fan wheezed as though it carried the weight of years. Yet to Ethan, it looked like treasure. Grace explained softly that she had pawned her wedding ring to afford it, brushing the detail aside as if it were nothing. But Ethan saw the way her eyes glistened under the lamplight. He touched the laptop carefully, like it was fragile glass, and realized it was not just a machine, but a doorway to another world, one his parents had never believed he could enter. That night, as the glow of the screen illuminated the walls plastered with his drawings, Ethan began his first attempts at coding. At first, his fingers moved clumsily, searching for rhythms in letters that refused to cooperate. Programs froze, crashed, or simply refused to run. He grew frustrated, gripping his hair, muttering under his breath that he was useless. More than once, he slammed the lid shut, his chest heavy with defeat. But Grace appeared each time, quiet but steady, sliding a plate of food beside him with the same phrase that had become their mantra: "Eat, then try again." And he did. He opened the laptop again, his fingers moving slower, steadier, and each keystroke became a promise to himself and to her. He would make this count. He would prove to her, to the neighbors, to the world that he was not the failure his parents had labeled him to be. Word of Ethan's obsession began to spread through the building. Neighbors whispered in the stairwell, saying the boy was wasting time, glued to a broken computer instead of facing reality. But others began to notice differently. "Funny thing," one man said quietly, "that kid's teaching himself what folks pay thousands to learn." Ethan heard fragments of these comments, and instead of discouraging him, they lit another fuse inside. Every evening became a cycle of trial and error, of code typed and broken, of problems faced and slowly conquered. Grace, though she understood little of what appeared on the screen, recognized the determination in his eyes and continued to believe. Months passed, and the boy once dismissed as incapable began to build small things that worked. His first success was a basic calculator program that helped a neighbor manage her weekly grocery budget. When she thanked him, slipping a small tip into his hand, Ethan felt pride bloom inside him, a pride not for money, but for proof that he could create something useful. Next came a rent tracker for the landlord, then a simple app that helped another tenant keep track of medical appointments. These were not grand inventions, but each one was a stone laid carefully on the foundation of his future. Grace celebrated every small victory as if it were the unveiling of a masterpiece, clapping her hands and smiling so wide that the wrinkles around her eyes deepened into maps of joy. Ethan grew taller, his frame leaner, his shoulders sharper, but his nights remained the same, lit by the glow of the laptop, filled with the hum of the old fan and the soft gospel melodies Grace hummed from a kitchen. He learned discipline through repetition, patience through failure, and resilience through sacrifice. Every project that failed taught him a shortcut. Every line of code that finally worked lit another fire in his chest. By the time he turned 19, the boy who had once been abandoned on a sidewalk was crafting tools that reached far beyond the walls of their building. One evening, as Grace sat beside him folding laundry, Ethan received an email that made his heart race. Someone online had noticed his work, a stranger from across the country who wanted to invest in one of his apps. Ethan read the words again and again, hardly believing they were real. He looked at Grace, his voice cracking as he explained, and she reached for his hand, whispering a prayer under her breath. When the phone call came, Ethan pitched his idea with trembling words but steady eyes, Grace sitting close enough that he could feel her presence like an anchor. On the other end of the line, the investor chuckled, impressed by the audacity of a boy teaching himself to build what others trained years to master. A small check arrived days later, not enough to change the world, but enough to change their lives. With that money, Ethan bought sturdier meals, a proper desk for his laptop, new shoes for Grace, and even an old second-hand car that coughed and sputtered, but carried them places buses never could. He had already crafted apps for neighbors, rent trackers, budget calculators, and appointment reminders. But those were just small sparks of a much larger fire burning inside him. Each failure he encountered taught him not despair but adaptation, and each success, no matter how small, fueled him with a hunger to build more. Grace would sit quietly in the kitchen, folding laundry or preparing modest meals, humming her soft gospel songs while Ethan hunched over the laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting in his eyes. The neighbors still gossiped, sometimes mocking the boy who had been discarded, but more often now they spoke with reluctant respect. "He's always in there with that busted computer," one tenant remarked, "but somehow he keeps making things work." Another voice replied, "Kid's smarter than people think. He's turning nothing into something." Ethan overheard just enough of these whispers to understand that the perception of him was shifting. He was no longer only the abandoned Collins boy. He was becoming the young man who refused to quit. By 19, his focus had sharpened. His nights stretched later, the hum of the laptop mixing with the rhythm of his heartbeat as he tapped out codes that began to form into practical applications. He reached online communities, forums where strangers across the world shared knowledge and ideas. He studied their posts late into the night, reverse engineering their projects, learning through mistakes and corrections, and quietly building his own reputation in those hidden corners of the internet. Soon, strangers were downloading his programs, small utilities that solved real problems in simple but effective ways. Each download felt like a validation, each message of thanks a reminder that his work mattered beyond the walls of the apartment. Grace, though she understood little about the intricacies of his code, recognized the transformation in him. She saw how his posture changed, how his once uncertain shoulders now squared with quiet confidence, how his voice grew steadier when he explained his projects. She could not follow the logic on the glowing screen, but she could see the logic in his eyes, the fire of a boy turning into a man with purpose. She encouraged him the only way she knew how, by continuing to sacrifice for him, by ensuring he had food to eat, light to work by, and the unwavering assurance that someone believed in him without condition. The small investor who had once taken a chance on Ethan opened the door for more. With each project Ethan completed, opportunities began to expand. What had started as modest checks now turned into larger ones, enough to not only improve their meals, but to ease the constant strain that had weighed on Grace for years. They no longer worried daily about rent or bus fare. The old second-hand car sputtered but gave them freedom, carrying them to places buses never reached. For Ethan, every improvement in their lives was a direct reminder of Grace's sacrifices, and he silently vowed to keep pushing, to keep creating, until her sacrifices were repaid in full. The world outside their apartment began to take notice too. Local tech blogs started to whisper about the young developer whose apps were spreading by word of mouth, marveling at how he had built a reputation without the formal education or prestigious background so many others depended on. Headlines began to circulate online, small but steady. Young founder disrupts industry basics. Self-taught developer builds tools for everyday problems. The articles painted him as a genius, but Ethan knew the truth. It was not genius that had carried him here, but the steady sacrifices of Grace and his refusal to quit when others gave up. At every small launch he attended, Grace came with him, sitting in the background with her gray hair tucked under a scarf, her eyes brimming with pride. Cameras flashed around Ethan, Reporters jotted down notes. Investors shook his hand. But his gaze always returned to Grace, seated quietly and smiling softly, as if she were watching her own child step into the sun after years in the shadows. To the outside world, she was invisible, just an old caretaker in the background. To Ethan, she was the foundation of everything. Despite his growing recognition, Ethan never forgot the cracked-wing toy airplane still hidden in his drawer, a relic of the night he was cast out. He sometimes took it out late at night, turning it over in his hands, remembering the boy who sat abandoned on the curb while neighbors whispered. But instead of pain, he now felt strength. The broken airplane was no longer just a symbol of rejection, but a reminder of resilience, proof that he had been broken but not destroyed. Grace's steady presence had rebuilt him, piece by piece, until he was strong enough to face the world. He remembered the cracked-wing airplane still hidden in his drawer, the memories of his parents' cold dismissal, the sacrifices Grace made every day by patching her shoes, skipping meals, and smiling even when she was exhausted beyond measure. All of that converged in his mind as he worked through the night, typing, correcting, deleting, and rebuilding until the code began to shape into something different from all the small utilities he had created before. This one had reach, this one had potential beyond the walls of their apartment building, and this one could carry him into the future they both deserved. The first app that truly broke through was born out of necessity. Grace had once struggled to keep track of her multiple cleaning jobs, writing schedules on scraps of paper that got lost or smudged, and Ethan decided to design a scheduling tool simple enough for her to use, but powerful enough to help anyone juggling multiple responsibilities. He poured weeks into refining it, testing features late into the night, asking Grace to try it even when she insisted she was too old to understand technology. Slowly, as she learned to input her shifts and set reminders, Ethan realized he had built something practical, something accessible, something real. When he released it online for free, downloads trickled in at first, then began to pour, not in millions, but in steady numbers that shocked him. Emails started arriving from people across the country, single parents balancing 2 jobs, students managing classes and work, small business owners trying to keep order in chaos. They thanked him, sometimes with words that made his chest tighten, and he forwarded every message to Grace, telling her, "This is because of you." One day, a message came not from a user, but from a venture capitalist who had stumbled across Ethan's app and wanted to speak with him. Ethan's hands trembled as he read the email, his heart pounding in disbelief. Grace was in the kitchen, folding laundry as always, when he rushed to her with the news. She listened, smiled gently, and placed her hand over his. "Don't be afraid," she said. "You've been preparing for this moment your whole life." Ethan laughed nervously, pointing out that he was barely 19, self-taught, with no degree, no pedigree, and no family name to lean on. Grace shook her head firmly. "What you have is stronger than all of that. You have resilience, and you have the truth of where you came from. Speak from that." The investor call came a week later. Ethan sat at the small desk, the laptop open, his notes scattered beside him. Grace sat across the table, her hands clasped together, whispering quiet prayers under her breath as he spoke into the microphone. His voice cracked once or twice, nerves threatening to overwhelm him, but his eyes stayed steady, and he explained his vision with the kind of passion born only from struggle. On the other end of the line, the investor chuckled, impressed by Ethan's audacity, impressed by the fire in his words, impressed by the fact that this boy with nothing but an old laptop had created something useful for thousands. The call ended with a promise, and within days, a small check arrived in the mail, larger than anything Ethan had ever held before. He and Grace stared at it together, laughing and crying in disbelief, knowing that it was more than money. It was validation. It was proof that the years of sacrifice had not been wasted. They used the funds wisely, carefully, like people who knew the sting of scarcity. The first purchase was food, better meals than the endless rice and beans they had scraped by with for years. The second was a sturdier desk for Ethan's laptop, a place where he could work without crouching on the floor for hours. The third was a new pair of shoes for Grace, ones that actually fit and did not need tape to hold them together. Ethan insisted on buying them, and though she protested, Tears filled her eyes when she finally slipped them on. The last purchase was an old second-hand car, one that coughed and sputtered when it started, but still carried them farther than buses ever could. To Grace, it meant independence. To Ethan, it meant progress. But more than the things they bought, it was what the breakthrough represented. For the first time, Ethan felt as though he had stepped out of the shadows and into the light, not fully, but enough to glimpse what was possible. He was no longer the abandoned boy whispered about by neighbors, no longer the failure written off by tutors, no longer the burden his parents had cast out. He was a young creator, a founder in the making, someone who had taken the scraps of opportunity given to him and turned them into something powerful. He began to believe, not just hope, that he could build a life worthy of Grace's sacrifices, a life where she would never again have to skip meals or pawn her treasures to give him a chance. The battered laptop with its missing key and flickering screen had carried him this far, but now he had resources to buy sturdier equipment, and with Grace Turner's careful budgeting, every dollar stretched into tools, opportunities, and moments of relief that made the grind bearable. Ethan continued to work late into the night, the hum of the newer laptop blending with the quiet prayers and hymns Grace still sang while cooking simple meals. But there was a new energy in their home, a current of possibility that neither of them had felt before, and Ethan fed on that energy with the hunger of someone who knew what it meant to starve, both in body and in spirit. As the scheduling app gained traction, Ethan built upon its foundation, refining its features, creating updates, and offering new tools to users who asked for more. He pored over every message, every bug report, and every thank you note, determined to make the product not just functional but exceptional. His user base grew from hundreds to thousands, then to tens of thousands, and suddenly he found himself fielding calls from journalists who wanted to know the story behind the young developer who had created something so impactful, without a degree, without funding, and without privilege. The first article that appeared in a local paper called him a self-taught innovator, and though the title made him blush, it was soon followed by blog posts and online features from national outlets that painted him as part of a new wave of entrepreneurs. The irony was not lost on Ethan. He had been thrown out by parents who believed he was too slow, too broken, too incapable, and now strangers were writing about his brilliance as though it had always been obvious. Grace attended every event with him, sitting quietly in the back rows of conference rooms, her scarf tied around her gray hair, her eyes glowing with pride. Ethan insisted she be present, introducing her to colleagues, investors, and journalists as the most important person in his life. Some smiled politely, not fully understanding the depth of what he meant, but others glimpsed the truth in the way he always looked toward her when he spoke. At product launches, when cameras flashed and reporters jotted notes, Grace sat quietly but firmly, her presence grounding him. She didn't understand every technical detail, but she understood sacrifice and resilience, and she recognized both in the man her boy was becoming. Ethan often said silently to himself while standing on stages, "Every clap is for her too." The recognition brought more opportunities. Investors offered larger checks, some trying to buy him out entirely. But Ethan refused to hand over his creation to anyone who did not respect the foundation on which it was built. He negotiated carefully, learning through experience, leaning on the same stubbornness that had once carried him through nights of failure. Each deal he made added not only funds but credibility, and soon his name was circulating in tech circles across the country. Young developers looked to him as proof that talent and determination could overcome pedigree and privilege. He received invitations to speak at conferences, to sit on panels, to mentor others. And though he sometimes felt like an imposter, he remembered Grace's words, "They don't get to decide. You decide." Their lives improved gradually but significantly. Meals became richer, clothes newer, and the apartment finally felt less like a holding place and more like a home. Grace no longer skipped meals, though Ethan often reminded her that he would never forget the years when she had. She no longer wore shoes patched with tape, and he made sure she had everything she needed, though she always protested that he was spending too much on her. For Ethan, every small gift he gave her was repayment for nights she had sacrificed her hunger, her health, and her peace of mind for him. They even replaced the old sputtering car with a more reliable vehicle, one that gave them freedom without the constant fear of breaking down. But despite these improvements, Ethan remained deeply aware of his beginnings. He kept the cracked-wing airplane on his desk now, not hidden away, a constant reminder of where he came from and of the night he was left on the curb with nothing but a bag and a broken toy. The world saw a young success story, a prodigy who had risen from nowhere to create something valuable. But Ethan knew better. He was not a genius, not a prodigy. He was the product of relentless persistence and the love of a woman who refused to abandon him. He carried that truth into every meeting, every launch, every interview, speaking not just of his apps, but of the values that shaped him. He told journalists that success was not built only on talent, but on sacrifice, that behind every headline was a story of someone unseen who made the climb possible. Some reporters scoffed, preferring to shape him into a lone hero, but others listened and included Grace in their stories, writing about the quiet woman in the scarf who sat in the background while her boy rose into the light. Grace was at his side at every launch, every conference, every product reveal, seated in the background with her scarf tied over her gray hair, her eyes proud, her smile faint but steady. For the world, she was almost invisible, but for Ethan, she was the only reason he stood there at all. The cracked-wing airplane still sat on his desk as a relic of the night he was abandoned. And every time he touched it before a speech, he reminded himself not of bitterness, but of resilience. Yet no amount of preparation could steel him for the moment when the past he had tried to bury came back into the light. It happened at the biggest launch of his career, the unveiling of a major platform that had attracted national media and investors from across the globe. The stage lights blazed, the giant screens behind him glowed with the logo of the company he had built from scratch, and rows of reporters scribbled notes as cameras flashed like bursts of lightning. Ethan stood at the podium, his microphone clipped neatly to his collar, his words calm but charged with the passion of someone who remembered every obstacle he had overcome. He spoke about innovation, about building tools that gave power to the overlooked, about creating technology that solved problems for real people instead of catering only to the elite. The audience leaned forward, captivated not only by the product, but by the authenticity of the man who presented it. Grace watched from the side of the stage, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, her eyes glistening with pride. She had prayed for this moment for years, prayed that the boy who had once been abandoned would one day stand before the world as proof that resilience was stronger than rejection. And then she noticed them before he did. Two figures in the crowd, their posture unmistakable, their clothes sharp, their faces lined, but still carrying the quiet arrogance of wealth. Charles and Vivian Collins had returned. They had walked into the room as if they had always belonged there, moving with the ease of people who had never been denied a seat at any table, their presence stirring whispers through the audience. "Are those his parents?" someone muttered. "Didn't they throw him out?" another asked. "Now they're here? Guess they're proud now." The murmurs spread like static, filling the gaps between camera clicks and coughs. Grace's lips pressed in, her stomach twisting with unease. She had known this day might come, but the sting of it still struck sharp when she saw the people who had cast Ethan out now positioning themselves to bask in his success. Ethan noticed them only after he concluded his main address, when he looked out over the sea of faces and felt his chest tighten. For a moment, he thought he was imagining things. But no, there they were, smiling, waving, stepping forward with the confidence of parents claiming their prodigal son. He froze, the microphone still in his hand, his mind flashing back to the night air of that Tuesday when the gate closed, when he sat on the curb clutching a broken toy, when the whispers of neighbors told him he was worthless. The audience began to clap, unsure of what was happening, as Vivian reached for the microphone and Charles clapped him on the back. "We only pushed you away to make you stronger," Vivian said smoothly, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone used to controlling narratives. "We always knew you had greatness in you." Charles nodded, his smile tight but confident. "We're proud of you, son. Look at what you've become." The audience, polite but skeptical, clapped again, though whispers rippled like cracks through the applause. "Didn't they abandon him? They're saying it was strategy? That's not how I remember the story." Ethan stood still, his hands clasped loosely before him, his chest thudding not with anger, but with the weight of choice. The boy inside him wanted to scream, wanted to throw their words back at them, wanted to tell the entire world what it had felt like to be discarded like trash. But the man he had become held steady, the years of Grace's guidance reminding him that his story was not about revenge, but about truth. He let the silence stretch, let it hum louder than the polite applause, let it settle heavy across the room until every camera, every reporter, every investor, every whisper turned to him. Grace's gaze steadied him from the side of the stage, her presence an anchor in the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Ethan finally raised the microphone, his voice calm but resonant. He looked at his parents, then at the audience, and then back at the cracked-wing airplane in his mind. "My parents say they pushed me away to make me stronger," he began, his words deliberate, each one sharp enough to cut through the tension. "But the truth is they broke me. They left me on a sidewalk when I was just a boy. They didn't believe in me. They didn't stand by me. And if I had stayed broken, I wouldn't be standing here today." Gasps rippled through the hall. Reporters leaned forward, and his parents' smiles faltered. Ethan paused, letting the truth hang heavy in the air, before continuing. "The person who made me strong, the person who believed when no one else did, is the one who stayed." He turned, extending his hand toward the side of the stage. Grace hesitated for a moment, clutching her shawl tighter, her heart pounding, but Ethan nodded to her, his eyes steady, and she stepped forward slowly. The audience erupted in murmurs, some gasping, others clapping. Ethan took her trembling hand, lifted it high for all to see, and said, "This is my real mother. She's the one who picked me up when I was nothing. She's the one who sacrificed, who worked, who prayed, who believed. Every success I have, every invention, every headline, it belongs to her." The audience rose in a standing ovation, clapping thunderously, while his parents stood frozen, pale and humiliated under the glare of truth. Cameras captured their silence, their carefully crafted performance, crumbling before the honesty of the son they had abandoned. Grace's eyes filled with tears, her smile breaking through as the crowd cheered, her hand trembling in Ethan's, but strong enough to hold him steady. The applause rolled through the hall like thunder, not for the polished faces of Charles and Vivian Collins, but for the woman who had stood in the shadows for 12 years and never once let go of the boy everyone else had abandoned. Ethan Collins held Grace Turner's hand high, and in that moment he felt more than vindication. He felt a deep clarity, the kind that comes when pain finally transforms into purpose. The audience clapped, some even standing, their cheers echoing off the walls, while the cameras flashed like lightning to capture the scene. His parents, who had arrived expecting to rewrite history with a polished lie, stood frozen, their smiles gone, their arrogance stripped away by the raw honesty of their son's words. Ethan looked at them, not with hatred, but with the calm steadiness of someone who had survived their betrayal and grown stronger because of the love they had failed to give. "Family isn't the ones who share your name," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "It's the ones who never let you fall." The words hit harder than any accusation could have, and the silence that followed was heavy with truth. Grace's hand trembled in his, her eyes wet with tears that reflected both pride and disbelief. She had never sought recognition, never wanted the spotlight, never imagined standing on a stage with the world looking at her. For years, she had only wanted to give Ethan a chance, to keep him safe, to remind him that his worth was not measured by the cruel standards of those who cast him aside. Yet here she was, lifted into the light by the very child she had saved, her sacrifices now honored in a way that made them no longer sacrifices but triumphs. She looked at him with a smile that carried the weight of every sleepless night, every skipped meal, every prayer whispered into the darkness. Ethan squeezed her hand tighter, silently promising that her struggles would never be forgotten, that everything he built from this day forward would be as much hers as his. The crowd's ovation continued, but within that noise, Ethan felt a quiet peace settle inside him. He had faced the people who had broken him, and he had chosen not to return their cruelty, but to reveal the truth. He understood now that revenge would have been shallow, a fleeting satisfaction, but truth was enduring, a light that once revealed could never again be hidden. His parents lowered their heads, retreating into the crowd, their presence shrinking until they looked smaller than he had ever remembered them. They had once seemed larger than life, gatekeepers of his worth, but tonight the world saw them as they truly were, people who abandoned their son when he needed them most, people whose wealth could not buy back the dignity they had thrown away. When the event ended, reporters rushed forward, investors clamored for quotes, but Ethan kept Grace close, guiding her through the crowd with the respect of a man leading royalty. Cameras shoved toward them, microphones pushed forward, but Ethan's words never wavered. "Every success I've had belongs to her. She is the reason I am here. She is the one who believed." The story spread quickly, newspapers and television networks echoing his declaration, and within days the narrative of his life was rewritten not as the triumph of a lone genius, but as the story of a boy saved by a woman who refused to abandon him. Grace's name began to appear in headlines alongside his, though she still preferred to stay out of interviews. Ethan made sure the world knew her truth even when she chose not to speak it herself. In the months that followed, Ethan's company grew larger, his influence broader, but he kept the cracked-wing airplane on his desk as a reminder that everything he had built came from broken beginnings. Grace moved with him into a new home, not a mansion that echoed with cold silence, but a warm house filled with the sounds of laughter, cooking, and the steady hum of life. She had her own room this time, a place of comfort that she had long been denied, but often she chose to sit in his office, knitting quietly while he worked late into the night, just to be near him as she always had. Ethan no longer worked out of desperation, but out of devotion, building tools that helped not only businesses, but ordinary people, honoring Grace's legacy of service and sacrifice in every line of code. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Grace asked softly if he had forgiven his parents. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "I don't know if I can forgive them," he admitted, his voice steady. "But I don't carry their weight anymore. I've given their place in my life to someone who deserves it." Grace smiled faintly, her eyes shining with pride. "That's enough," she said. They sat in silence then, watching the sunset paint the sky, knowing they had already won the only battle that mattered. Years later, when Ethan's name had become one of the most recognized in technology, when his company was listed among giants, when his face appeared in magazines and interviews, he never once let the world forget Grace Turner. At every award, every speech, every honor, he pointed to her, the woman who had chosen him when no one else did, the woman who had redefined family not as blood but as loyalty. And though she always blushed and waved it off, her eyes told him she understood. The end of Ethan's story was not about money, not about fame, not even about innovation. It was about the truth he had carried into the world. That family is not the ones who share your name, it is the ones who refuse to let you go. Grace had saved him with nothing but her faith and her sacrifice. And in return, he gave her the recognition and honor she deserved, proving to everyone that love, loyalty, and resilience are stronger than abandonment, wealth, or pride. And so the boy who was once left kneeling on the cold pavement with a cracked toy in his hand stood tall before the world, not broken but whole, not alone but chosen, living proof that sometimes the people the world overlooks are the very ones who change it forever. The end. If this story touched you, take a moment to show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel so you never miss the next story. I'd love to hear what you think about Ethan's journey. Was there a moment in the plot that struck you the most, or did Grace's sacrifices remind you of someone in your own life? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. Your words help keep these stories alive and connect us across places and experiences.